Mr. Keith.
Ms. Swinson, may we move on to a new topic, that of mis and disinformation, and have up 000502085. This is a recommendation or a submission. If we go to page 1, to the Permanent Secretary, Secretary of State.
The Parliamentary Secretary.
Parliamentary Secretary, sorry.
Yep.
Parliamentary Secretary and Secretary of State. Concerning planned cross-government communications on vaccination, including work being undertaken to enhance vaccine confidence and tackle misinformation. In general terms, was the issue of tackling dis and misinformation something that was exclusively for the DHSC, or was this a cross-government issue and included Cabinet Office, DCMS and its counter-disinformation unit, the NHS, no doubt, PHE, and perhaps other bodies?
Yes, it was, as a government lead, it was the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the Cabinet Office led the Communications Hub, and all those you mentioned would have been involved in some way.
If we go to page 2, we can see references to, obvious references to research, showing quite considerable levels of concern about levels of trust, distrust, vaccine hesitancy. And a paragraph 6, this, to alleviate concerns, information on how the vaccines are deployed and tested, including their safety and efficacy, must be communicated clearly to the public. It's crucial to understand and address factors that may affect COVID-19 vaccine acceptability in ethnic minority and lower income groups. So the starting point is the government, although this is only a DHSC document, couldn't not have been aware of the need to deal with misinformation, disinformation, and particularly the related issue of trust and distrust, and the degree to which particular sectorial groups were being prevented from taking up vaccination or were being put off it. There's a reference further down the page to the need for further research, for surveys, to understand motivations and barriers. And over the page, in fact, page 5, please, paragraphs 13 to 17, page 5, paragraphs 13 to 17. The submission says this: research has shown rebutting each individual narrative is not as effective as ensuring that individuals have access to the best quality information. Most individuals that share misinformation are well-meaning. If you attack them, there's a risk of alienation. And so the position appears to have been reached by the government generically that the best way to deal with high and increasing levels of mistrust and to deal with dis and misinformation is not to try to engage with it directly on each specific point or myth or trope or observation that's being made in the public domain, but just to keep on plugging the corporate line, if you like. Try to get out there and repeat facts and figures and the objective reality of what you're trying to say. Do you think that was effective as an approach, bearing in mind that all the evidence now suggests that levels of distrust are higher than ever, levels of vaccine hesitancy are higher than ever, and that trust in government and the NHS in particular appears to have dropped?
So based on the evidence and the research we had, misinformation, I think we did need to address head-on people's concerns. They were related to the safety of the vaccine, so it was important that we proactively responded to that, whether certain groups were at risk, and concern about side effects, for example. So we put that in the kind of misinformation camp. I think on disinformation, and as this set out, largely done for good reasons and questioning. It's a very much smaller percentage of people who are proactively putting out disinformation. I think on that we took the approach that you said, not to engage in a
turf war.
something that was that had been set out. So that's the approach we took. There were much smaller rates of disinformation actually in the UK than in quite a lot of other countries. But as you say, trust in the vaccine programme was related to the position before the pandemic and now about overall trust in government.
Realistically, was there much that could be done about that? Or you could keep on getting the facts and figures, the position about safety, about side effects, about the opportunities for delivery, acceptance of vaccines out there. But is there a step or a limit to what you can do? And in practical terms, did you reach that point?
So I think it varied according to groups. So the data would show, for example, I think in the Bangladeshi population, there was a big increase in confidence in trust, whereas for some other groups, that didn't improve as much. Overall, in fact, at the generic level, 2020 compared to 2021, positive sentiment went up to 96% on the vaccine. Obviously, though, it is the generic figures hide a myriad of different groups and reasons, some of which were effectively addressed and some of which weren't.
Do you think more progress would have been made? Do you think the outcome would have been better if there'd been more use of local figures, community champions, trusted figures, that just the governmental back had been put further into trying to use representatives of each particular community better and appeal through them to their communities?
Yes, that is definitely, again, what the research shows, that for communities where trust in government is low, it shouldn't be government giving the message. So it's exactly community champions working in local areas. I think quite a lot was done on that. Maybe it could have been started a bit earlier. The Community Champions campaign that you talked about, that was the approach in order to obviously do some things nationally, but local communities, local religious groups, local voluntary groups, to use them where they were happy to take that message into their communities as a more trusted voice.
So more could have been done at the micro level in terms of appealing through local and community trusted figures to various sectors, cohorts and communities.
I'm sure more could always be done, and it's an issue now in local communities for take-up of other vaccine campaigns.
Yeah. Well, now, of course, to some extent, sow and ye shall reap. We heard expert evidence yesterday about the increased levels of distrust and hesitancy, and there's a knock-on effect, of course. Another angle to this, another aspect of it is the policy of vaccination as a condition of deployment, because the evidence appears to show there was a considerable backlash, both in the care sector, where the first policy was actually introduced, and also in the wider healthcare community, as a result of the second proposal, which never came to pass, but the consultation process by which it was going to be introduced in a wider sense. If we just have a look at 000497213, we can see that in January 2022, so about a month and a half, or just over a month before the plug was pulled in relation to the expansion of the VCOD policy to the wider healthcare sector, the Secretary of State and Minister for Care and Mental Health, was that Helen Whately? I forget.
At the time, yes, pretty sure.
Were asked to note the most recent public health evidence on vaccine effectiveness in relation to VCOD, to note the emerging evidence of vaccine effectiveness against Omicron and the implication on the VCOD policy. And if we look at pages 3 to 4, 20 to paragraphs 20 to 32, you will see that the thrust of this submission was that in terms of deploying a VCOD policy to the wider care sector and to frontline healthcare workers, the benefit, that is to say, the prospect of increasing vaccination rates, appeared to be less clear because, of course, the transmission was ending. Omicron was making some vaccines less effective, and it was going to be a great deal harder to push rates up even further than they were already. And the demerit, the downside of the policy became clear that from the first VCOD policy, there had been a considerable backlash, had there not? So was it your department's position in the end, in fact, I think on the 1st of March, that it ultimately wasn't worth the candle?
So I think what happened through the Omicron wave is that the evidence changed on whether to what extent the vaccine protected the individual against transmission and in addition to severe disease. And the case, the policy case for introducing this policy was that it would affect transmission to those at risk. Obviously, that it was a controversial thing at the time, and different things were weighed up, but that was the policy, the rationale.
Sure.
When it became clear through the research on Omicron that the vaccines were not nearly as effective on transmission, that policy case was no longer held, and so it was both withdrawn in the care home sector and not brought into force for all other health and care settings.
It became apparent to the GHSE also, didn't it, that as a result of the first policy, the care home worker policy and the imposition of VCOD on them, that a very large number of people had left the sector. So people had walked away because they didn't want to be vaccinated. And you were also aware by this time of the considerable degree of backlash. People took the view that it was a matter for their individual decision as to whether or not they should be vaccinated. And the policy appears to have led to an increase in distrust and into hesitancy. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Would you next time round go straight away, as you did during the COVID pandemic, for VCOD in relation to care home workers, if that was the most vulnerable area and the area most affected by a pandemic?
Yes, I mean, it was a political decision to weigh those things up, and for the personal freedoms against the protection of those most vulnerable. That debate would happen again, depending
Yes.
where politically ministers took that choice. I think that it was clear when it was introduced and through the public consultation that not everyone supported the policy, but ministers and indeed Parliament, in agreeing the regulations, put that in place. In terms of care home workers, there were a range of where anecdotally and in survey evidence, I think it was a reason given for leaving the sector. It did drive rates up to over 90% as it was a legal requirement, but it was also in choosing to leave that sector. There's a number of reasons on pay. It was also when the economy was opening up again, so there's a lot of movement between social care, hospitality, retail. So there's a whole range of reasons of which this it's very hard to disentangle.
Very. And of course, the devolved administrations didn't pursue VCOD. None of them did. England was the only country that did in relation to that first policy.
Care homes.
Care homes. And their rates of uptake were not significantly lower than England's. So it's very hard to say at the end of the day whether or not it worked and whether or not we've created a beast for the future in terms of distrust and hesitancy and so on. Would one way of trying to fight our way through that particular thicket be to understand better, firstly, how many people did leave the sector as a result of the policy, and secondly, to what degree does a policy such as mandatory vaccination harm us in the long run in terms of willingness to take a vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's an answerable research question in retrospect, but if that were possible, that would be obviously very interesting. There's evidence on different countries, both for vaccination for flu, for other things that the WHO also brings together. It's a mix of factors I think the professional expectation on healthcare workers and indeed on care workers, we also see through the annual flu campaigns, and rates are not as high in those groups as they are for the others at risk.
The vaccine damage payment scheme next.
Yes.
The inquiry is obviously well aware that the payment scheme is not a compensation scheme.
Correct.
It's also something that has a statutory foundation, so it's a matter for Parliament. And also it's something in which it requires intense ministerial oversight. So ultimately, questions on the remit and the scope of the scheme must be for ministers because it involves the payment of public monies. Your statement makes plain that obviously with the arrival of COVID-19 as a trigger disease for the severe disablement which must be established was added by statutory instrument. The £120,000 payment, not, I emphasise, a compensatory payment, but a flat rate payment, was introduced in July 2007.
Yes.
And with the onset of COVID and with the obvious explosion in applications, the body responsible for dealing with these applications, the NHS Business
Services Authority,
thank you, increased its membership. I think it has about 80 or more members of staff now working on it. The documentation which your department has provided, let's have a look at 000411744. Dated June 22, makes plain that your colleagues and ministers considered, page 2, changes to the scheme. There was a proposal perhaps to increase the £120,000 flat payment, which, is this right, if a claimant establishes a 60% disablement and also that the disablement is causally the result of the vaccine, and obviously COVID was a prescribed, and the COVID vaccines were prescribed vaccines,
yes,
they get the lump sum of 120,000.
That's correct.
There isn't a sliding scale.
Correct.
There was a debate about lifting that amount because it had last been uprated in 2007. And there was a debate also about actually sliding scales in terms of the disablement, which had to be established, the degree of disablement, in order to receive a payment. There was obviously a fair bit of thought given into whether or not the scheme should be changed, bearing in mind that if it was changed, you'd then have to backdate. You'd have to top up any claims of which had already been made. But what happened? We see very little in the paperwork about the outcome of this consultation process, internal consultation process. There weren't any changes made, it would seem, to the rate, or the threshold, or the 60% disablement categorisation. Nothing happened. Is that the sum of it?
Certainly in this time period, yes, advised the Secretary of State on the current position and the options. As you've said, they would be matters for ministers to ask to take forward. I know there has been a lot of focus on improving the efficiency of the scheme so that those who've applied get a result. And so there's been focus on that, but the ministers haven't taken a decision on any of those points as far as I'm aware.
Was a decision taken not to pursue the recommended policy options identified at box 3C 1 and 2, or is it that no decision has in fact been made at all?
Looking at the date, I mean, obviously there have been a number of different Secretaries of State, and I think this was just before, whilst Javid was still in post, and he resigned shortly afterwards. So I don't know if, I'm sure you would have had the paper of any response to this submission, but there hasn't been a response asking the department to implement any of those potential changes.
But we haven't seen a document one way or the other as to whether or not a decision was made, or if it was made, as it must have been if it was made, to decline the recommendation. But the upshot is the same. There were no changes made to the scheme were there in 2022, despite the explosion in the number of applications, and of course, as you were well aware, very real issues being raised in the department about quantum, the amount, the speed with which applications were dealt with, the causation threshold, and the issue of graduated payments, if at all. I don't want to ask you your views on them because it's a departmental policy issue.
Yep.
And it will be for my lady to determine what, if anything, should be done about the scheme, and of course for Parliament to take a view on it in due course. But
yeah, the scheme is still operating in the statutory way that you set out with on those three bases. There have been no changes.
So, despite these very obvious problems which were being brought to your attention, the scheme has not been altered in any shape or form since, in fact, the raising of the threshold to £120,000 in 2007.
That's the factual position, yes.
Thank you. Two final topics, please. Just to go back to the subject of clinical trials, in particular phase 2 trials for therapeutics, Ms. Svensson. I asked you some questions about the degree of management and coordination concerning the phase 2 trial process for therapeutics. And the inquiry is aware of the accord process, the evidence in writing from Professor Sir John Bell, Professor Sir Jonathan Van Dam and Sir Jeremy Farrer about what appeared to them to be quite a high level of dysfunctionality and lack of good planning in terms of trying to bring some order to the proliferation of phase 2 trials. There were a lot of them. There were different funders. They had different numbers of recruits, of participation. And Charlotte Dean from UKRI has written to has put in her statement for the inquiry that the main lesson to learn is that in the case of a national emergency, the UK should have access to a national platform that can deliver integrated, coordinated and comprehensive, that is to say, covering phase 1 to 3 clinical trials, so that there's a UK-wide structure that can select potential interventions, direct resources and coordinate to ensure rapid approvals and trial setup. Would you agree?
Greater coordination for the clinical trials, I do agree on. I don't know much detail about the Accord platform, though I've read the statement you refer to. And I know that the technical report from the UK CMOs and others points to greater success in phases 3 and 4 than 1 and 2.
Yes.
So I would agree with that. I would just say in terms of the platform trials, of which recovery is the most well-known, the way that those were set up, recruited to, and the impact that those trials had were truly world-leading, saved 1 million lives. The first output on dexamethasone in June 2020. So there were a range of trials, and as also the technical report sets out, having them adequately, having enough people in the trial so that they can read out and have an impact is obviously very important. I think the ones you're referring to were ones where, or the concerns were that they were never adequately recruited so that they could read out and make a clear readout on whether the things they were testing were effective or not.
You'd make, if I may observe, a very fine politician. There's a reference to dexamethasone, and there's no doubt the recovery trial had a number of groundbreaking results, including dexamethasone. But you are aware, and we've got evidence from Lord Sharma on this, that the advisory group that he had advising him on therapeutic, in particular phase 2 trials, corporately held its head in its hands at some of the confusion and the lack of coordination around about the clinical trial process. Would you agree that it was plain that a higher degree of coordination and management was required?
As we're talking about therapeutics, I wanted to point to the one bit of world-leading research. There were a range of platforms I don't know well enough. There were certainly some that work very effectively. I've seen the concerns about Accord, which were led out of UK Research and Investment and BEIS, and I have no reason to doubt them, and that better coordination would always be a good thing.
Because the Therapeutics Task Force and the Therapeutic Research and Development was exclusively, thanks to your ministers, a DHSC enterprise, as opposed to the Vaccine Task Force, which was BEIS.
Yes, I mean the funding, so there's the National Institute for Health Research, which is £1 billion roughly from the Department of Health. There's very substantial funding through BEIS for trials through the UK Research and Investment, and the medical research councils that are funded through that, which are funded through BEIS.
Yes. The Antiviral and Therapeutics Task Force and its recommendations of November 22 on the topic of antivirals proposed the building of a library of prototype antivirals that could then be used swiftly or pushed swiftly through the phase 2 and 3 clinical trial process on the onset of a novel pathogen. You must have been aware of that recommendation as in your position in the DHSC. Is that something that you would support?
Yes, there are people much better qualified technically about what that would mean in practice, but clearly the next pandemic will not be the same as this one. Having a range of potential on both the vaccines and therapeutic side and antivirals would be a very sensible thing. That is both about getting things into phase 1 trials, but also identifying potential viruses of pandemic potential, and then having research options on both vaccines and therapeutics, of which antivirals would be a part.
And finally, on this topic, we've seen reference in the Rule 9 statements to a body called the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. Can you just help us? Is that a DHSC supervised body, do you know, or something different?
Not that I'm aware.
I know acronyms in government are much beloved.
Is
it an arm's length body? Is it an EA? What is it?
It's definitely not an EA.
It's not
or
one of yours.
Arm's length body.
All right. Evusheld, finally.
Yes.
There were two aspects to Evusheld. First was the decision not to make an advance purchase or not to pursue an advance purchase. And the evidence makes it plain that Professor Sir Chris Whitty wrote to the Vaccine Task Force, copied to the DHSC, that he couldn't recommend the buying of a large amount in advance of the Evusheld therapeutic to be used prophylactically. That decision, and I must make plain that Sir Chris Whitty's recommendation refers to a number of reasons why the landscape has changed, why there might not be a purpose to it or a sufficient purpose to it, and so on. But the decision has been roundly criticised by, in particular, Dame Kate Bingham, by Clive Dix, and numbers of other people, in particular, the immunosuppressed, to whom that prophylactic could have come as a great source of help. Was the DHSC aware when the decision was made that it left the immunosuppressed, in particular, very exposed in terms of the absence of that particular therapeutic remedy?
So the recommendations need to be on the basis of whether such a treatment would be effective. The DHSC was definitely aware that we're looking for a range of treatments right across the disease path, and the immunosuppressed and those who couldn't take a vaccine were a really important group. They still, however, the evidence base on whether a treatment would first be authorised by MHRA and deployable are things that need to be taken into account. And both at that point and the subsequent year, the clinical advice from Rapid C19 that we talked about earlier to the CMO and then to ministers is that there was insufficient evidence for that to support procurement.
But in the case of vaccines, massive at-risk advanced purchasing was made in the complete absence of any real clinical data to suggest they would work, indeed in advance of the completion of clinical trials.
Yeah.
And later, when it came to the decision whether or not to authorise the purchase and deployment of Evusheld in 2022 as a treatment, and that's the process, the rapid C19 process that you spoke of. The decision by rapid C19 not to go ahead with Evusheld wasn't based on clinical data so much as a view being taken on how useful it would be given the emergence of Omicron in particular. So Evusheld didn't receive the same fair crack of the whip as all the vaccines had.
So first of all, rapid C19 would definitely have looked at the clinical data. As we set out in 2021, the context was different given we had such effective vaccines. There certainly were advanced purchase agreements in place for some therapeutics, but you're right that the advice was not to put that in place for this treatment. And in the event, our advanced purchase agreements were, I think, always on the basis of getting to a conditional marketing authorization, and that happened for Evusheld in the spring of 2022.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. Ms. Naik, I think you've got some questions. Thank you. Can you see that away?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, milady. Thank you. Ms. Swinson, I represent the Migrants Primary Care Access Group, and I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions based on what you said. It's in your witness statement at paragraph 129. You obviously don't have to look that up, but it's about translation. What you said there was that translation was a priority to reach those whose first language is not English. I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on what measures were taken to disseminate public health information into translated languages and at what time those measures were taken.
I'm afraid I don't have detail about exactly what materials, but both Public Health England or UXA, depending on the timescale here, and NHS England, I know in normal business would make available information in different languages. It's obviously important for accessibility, as I've set out, but you would need to put that to Public Health England or NHS England.
So you can't help me with whether those measures were taken in respect of translations was sufficient and successful, because that's something you can't speak to.
Yes, that's for other organisations.
Okay, well, I think we will then have to put that elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Naik. Ms. Beattie, who's also just in front.
Thank you, Ms. Swinson. I ask questions on behalf of disabled people's organisations. The department published the vaccines delivery plan on the 11th of January 2021, which Mr. Keith has already referred to. And that referred to directly employed personal assistants forming part of the social care workforce. Could we bring that up, please? It's INQ 000 411 678. And we're at page 42 of the document. If we could please highlight the third paragraph towards the end. The final sentence there says that it was vital to identify and reach directly employed personal assistants as part of our efforts to ensure full coverage of the priority 2 cohort. And just to remind everyone, that was a cohort that included frontline health and social care workers. Is that right?
That's correct.
Disabled people's organisations are aware of concerns raised by disabled people who employ personal assistants about a lack of clarity on how to secure vaccines for personal assistants and when their staff could be vaccinated, and that they were bounced between GP, clinical commissioning group and council with no organisation taking responsibility. What, if any, guidance did the department provide to disabled people and personal assistants to facilitate vaccine access and uptake of the vaccine by personal assistants who, for disabled people, are part of the frontline social care workforce?
They are, and as set out here, I think the department made clear they were part of that cohort in terms of specific guidance for them on how to access vaccines. I think that would have been through the local NHS and also, as set out in the Green Book, it might have said more there.
Well, I think the Green Book doesn't mention personal assistants at all by name.
Okay.
Are you saying that there was local NHS guidance which was directed to disabled people and personal assistants that covered this matter?
I'm saying that this sets out the cohort. It was an NHS operational issue for how to invite the people in those cohorts under this and for each cohort to come forward for their vaccination.
And so is your answer that there was nothing from the department itself that covered this?
I'm not aware of any specific guidance on personal assistance in priority 2 cohort, no.
And further to that, did the department undertake any consultation with disabled people and disabled people's organisations about facilitating access by personal assistants to vaccination?
These issues would have been covered on JCVI and part of the PSED, the equality impact assessment, but I'm not aware of anything in further detail. It would have been an operational matter for NHS England.
And just to be clear, do either that advice or a PSED, does that include consultation actually with disabled people and DPO?
I'm not aware of consultation on the JCVI guidance in the way you set out, no.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. I think that completes the questions for you, Ms Winton. I'm really grateful. I know you've helped me before. I don't know whether I'm going to be asking you to help me again, and I do understand the burden that we place upon your old department, and I suspect also your current department. So thank you very much for the help you've given to date. I hope we haven't kept you hanging around too long, Ms Little.
Not at all. Absolutely fine waiting.
My lady, the next witness is Catherine Little.
If you could repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please sit down.
Congratulations on your new role since we last met.
Oh, thank you very much.
Please could you say your full name?
Catherine Little.
Thank you for attending to assist the inquiry today. Could I ask you, as you may have heard with other witnesses, just to keep your voice nice and loud and speak slowly. You have produced a witness statement, INQ 000474557, dated the 21st of October 2024. It runs to 80 pages and annexes and 220 exhibits. It is signed by you. Can you confirm that you have had the opportunity to read it recently and that it is true to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to start with some background matters first.
Up front, if I may, I'd quite like just to personally express my sincere sorrow for the impact that the pandemic has had on so many lives, and also just to assure the inquiry how prominent the risk of life was in all of the considerations that we undertook in the Treasury.
Thank you. Your professional background. After a career in professional services, you joined the civil service in 2013, went on to hold senior roles in the Ministry of Justice and Defence, and then joined the Treasury in 2020 as Director of Public Spending. Is that correct?
And the Director General of Public Spending.
I'm so sorry.
I apologise.
I thought that was what I had
Apologies
said.
for
Director
correcting
General of
you.
Public Spending. Thank you. Could you explain what roles you have taken since that time?
Yes, so in October 2022, I became the second permanent secretary of the Treasury with responsibility for public spending and international matters. And then in April 2024, I became the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office and the Chief Operating Officer for the Civil Service.
You mentioned some key figures in your statement. I'm sure is news to no one, but just to remind ourselves, Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor for the entirety of the period that we're going to be discussing today. And the other key figures you mentioned in your statement are Steve Barclay MP and Simon Clarke, who successively held the roles of Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Within the Treasury, is it right that there was a dedicated team for COVID-19 vaccines from March 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
And at all times, that COVID-19 vaccines team worked closely with the Department of Health and Social Care and the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, particularly closely with those two departments.
Yes.
We can't endeavour here, of course, to unpick the complex web that you set out in your statement of decision-making, of requests for funding and approvals processes, and the sophisticated thought that went into that and the negotiation of contracts. So I just want to take you through some of the headlines about the approach that the Treasury took to vaccines and therapeutics during the period that Module 4 is concerned with. The first topic I'm going to ask you about is vaccine development, procurement and manufacture. You explain in your statement, and I'm just going to ask you to assist us a little here with the general approach, i.e. The approach to spending approval not in a situation as the department was in during COVID. Is it right that the principles that you follow are set out in your statement are regularity, propriety, value for money, and feasibility, but that general framework was applied with a great deal of flexibility when it came to vaccines and therapeutic spending approval?
Yes, that's correct. And to expand, if I may, the principles of the Managing Public Money framework were consistent throughout. We didn't change the framework in any way, but we did apply, one, a much higher level of risk-taking, and secondly, we adapted and flexed it in a very pragmatic way to suit the circumstances that we were dealing with.
So if we might turn to some of those specific approaches, funding the vaccine programme, and if we could have on the screen INQ 000421318, please. This is Treasury officials' advice to the Chancellor, advice that was accepted regarding the COVID-19 vaccine development strategy dated the 7th of April 2020. If we could turn, please, to page 2, at paragraphs 2 to 3, perhaps to set out some of the context in which your department was working. Vaccine development, we read here, is high risk and poses significant technical and time challenges. Several scientific approaches, each with different manufacturing requirements. Paragraph 3 that recognises that by pooling resources and risk internationally, we can increase the global chances of success. But the scale of investment required, it's recognised, is going to be substantial. There's no guarantee of success. If we could also turn, please, to page 7 of that document. At that point, reminding ourselves that the 7th of April, there were 3 candidate vaccines, which all had different manufacturing needs. We see there the vaccine being developed at Imperial College London, and then there's mention of the vaccine being developed at Oxford in B, and mention of Moderna at C. And of course, we know now that whilst one vaccine at Imperial College London didn't make it to approval stage, B and C are what would go on to become vaccines that were used in the UK. Thank you, we can take that document down. Whilst we know that now, is it right to say that the vaccines programme was extremely unusual at the time in terms of its uncertainty and unusual in the Treasury approach to spending control?
That is right. It was highly unusual, but our overwhelming advice at the time was that it was right to take a much higher risk approach because the overwhelming case for the benefits, both to public health and to the economy, was so significant it outweighed any of the initial risks. So we advised the Chancellor to invest in all vaccines that proved to be promising and to explore every single opportunity at this stage.
You describe that as a 3-stage approach in your statement. The first is a generous commitment envelope. Can you translate for us? What does that mean, a generous commitment envelope?
So normally what we would do in public spending is to provide a precise amount of money for a very precise outcome that the government is trying to achieve. In this instance, we took the view that given we really didn't know what it would ultimately cost or over what time frame, that we should give the maximum amount of flexibility and provide a funding envelope over a multi-year period that was significant enough to allow the vaccines task force to operate with a significant amount of freedom and pragmatism. That is absolutely unheard of outside of a spending review or in normal spending practice.
I was going to say, it must have gone against all your instincts of you and your colleagues.
It did, and I think it's fair to say I expected to come into the Treasury to control public spending with an iron fist, and I ended up spending a huge amount of money and changing our risk appetite radically almost overnight.
And that resulted, isn't it, in a 3-year period being covered by the envelope and by funding outside of the usual spending review period, I think, as you've described. Second, then, the Treasury sought explicit ministerial consent in respect of indemnities. Is it right that ministerial consent is required for all government contracts involving indemnification because of the liabilities to the Exchequer?
Yes, and it's actually important that approvals are sought from Parliament because the contingent liabilities produced by these sorts of indemnities are so novel and contentious and potentially very significant to public finance.
I'm not going to ask you to go into the detail of any individual contracts or negotiations or the specific terms, indeed, of indemnity arrangements at any point in your evidence. But is it right to summarise it in this way, that indemnities were agreed by the Treasury for vaccine developers in which the Exchequer bore a much higher share of the risk than would normally be the case, in order to be successful, or in order for the VTF to be successful in negotiations with developers to secure contracts?
Yes, that's correct. And we took the view that we had to take exceptional risk in order to secure those commercial arrangements quickly and ahead of global demand in this space.
Do you think, as far as you're able to know, do you think it is likely that had the UK taken a different approach by not agreeing to such indemnities, it would have been able to secure the vaccine supply contracts that it did?
I think it's highly unlikely that we would have been able to secure those contracts given the pace of demand on a global level, and pace and risk-taking were key in the success of the commercial arrangements.
The third and final element of the framework that you set out in your statement was increasing the limit to which the Treasury delegated authority to be suspend without specific prior approval. Can you just explain a little about that and why it was different?
In normal times, every department has a risk-based delegated approval level that's set every year by the Treasury. For Bays, that was set previously at £70 million. We increased that to £150 million, which was a bit of a judgment call as to what the right level was, but we felt that having seen some of the activity that was underway, that was a level that would allow them to pragmatically sign up to further expenditure without any further delay by coming to us.
So pausing there and taking stock of that framework, which you've helpfully described to us an overview, are there lessons that can be learned in respect of future pandemics and preparedness from the flexible approach adopted in the COVID vaccination development programme?
Yes, and we've talked about two of them. The third one that I would add, and I know many witnesses have talked about, is the governance arrangements that we put in place through the ministerial panel. In normal times, spending approvals would go through a multiple sequence stage process, and in effect we streamlined and collapsed all of that into one decision-making process. And we would certainly repeat that again if we were in the situation.
Just finishing perhaps off that point about the VTF ministerial panel, ordinarily separate ministerial approval would have been required for each spending decision by Bays, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. And so you describe that single decision point. To be clear, it's not that the Treasury lost any of their usual authority, power, final say, whatever we want to term it, in those spending decisions. It's just that you collaborated at that stage. Would that be a correct summary?
Yes, that's correct. It's important to emphasise that the Treasury cannot delegate its responsibilities for Treasury consent for novel, contentious or repercussive matters, and that is an important constitutional principle in the role of Parliament and how it delegates its authority to the Treasury.
I want to move on now to the specifics of the Vaccine Taskforce programme business case. Funding for the vaccines programme between March and July 2020 was drawn from a combination of funding sources on a case-by-case basis. And was it considered that it was important to build a more stable base of funding for the VTF and that they then made a business case for that funding base in the beginning of July 2020?
Yes, I think we realised very early on that this process of continually coming back to the Treasury was not going to be an effective way of operating, and that business case was specifically to justify the multi-year funding envelope.
There were a number of adjustments to that business case, and I'm not going to enter into the complex back and forth of that. But just to go to the headlines here, is it right that the final business case went in on the 29th of July 2020, and that then the sum that was requested, which was 5.23 billion at that stage, was finally settled in September, but that the VTF were notified that approval was earlier. It was that the official letter, as it were, went out in September.
Yes, that's correct, and that's quite normal for us to receive a readout from a minister, in this case the Chief Secretary, to let the department know, and then for us to formalise the conditions of that approval over a slightly slower time. But we're talking about a matter of days.
You were aware that there were some concerns raised by Dame Kate Bingham at the time about the delay in this process. I don't intend to go through all of those in detail because, of course, the specifics of what was or wasn't appropriate in this pandemic may differ next time, depending on the nature of any virus or potential vaccines to combat it. But in terms of the broad lessons we might learn from some of the concerns raised by Dame Kate Bingham at the time, you're aware that concern was raised about the speed of approvals, that was raised on the 22nd of July 2020 in a meeting with the Prime Minister, and that essentially the concern was that making a business case with certainty, with anything approaching certainty about figures was very difficult because being asked to estimate quantity and cost of vaccines in June or July 2020, when there was no clear idea of what those figures would be, was challenging, and that it was rigid and consumed the VTF's time and energy and caused delays. Do you understand those concerns, and can you explain what the Treasury's response to that was?
So I've obviously spoken to Kate, and I talked to her at the time about her concerns. I think there's a few things I would say in response. Firstly, the Treasury at this time was often signing off very complex material amounts of public spending, often within 48 hours of us receiving a case. That is an extraordinary thing for us to do, given the scale of public spending and the risks that were involved. And our teams worked around the clock to make sure that frontline services, and in this case the vaccine task force, got as much approval as quickly as possible to get resources to where it was needed most. Throughout the period when we were looking at the funding envelope, we continued to sign off specific approvals, and we signed off £1.3 billion worth of additional specific approvals so that we could continue with the momentum and the pace of the work of the vaccine task force. I think it is absolutely right and proper that a business case is produced. It's fundamentally the record of how we are looking at decision making and the risk and benefits to the taxpayer. And I think on the actual use of the Green Book, this sort of views that it's quite a rigid way of undertaking investment appraisal. A few things I'd say. Firstly, the Green Book has been developed as best practice in investment appraisal over many decades.
Can I just pause you there, because we have another Green Book in this inquiry.
Yes,
can you just explain what the Green Book is as you're referring to it?
Apologies, sorry, there are lots of books. The Green Book from a Treasury perspective is the guidance that sets out how practitioners should undertake government investment appraisal for the public sector. And it is seen globally as one of the most long-standing, mature sets of guidance in this space. There's lots of myths about the Green Book. So a number of witnesses have referred to there being a sort of magic benefit-cost ratio, or that the templates were very rigid. It's not designed to be a prescriptive approach. It is a toolkit of methodologies, and it fundamentally sets out how you consider quantifying risk and uncertainty when you are dealing with so many unknowns. And I think this is very, very pertinent to the vaccine task force. That is not unusual in government and the public sector. So it's important that when we're talking about this sort of sum of money, which is nearly a penny on income tax, that we are really thinking about the material risk and benefits to society. And I think it's important to take a proportionate approach. We're not telling departments how to do it, we are giving them guidance.
So are you of the view that there is another better, perhaps more scientific, less financial model that might be used in these scenarios that could be more nimble? Or is your position that the model that was used was appropriate?
I don't agree with the idea that you should have a scientific case. The Green Book sets out quite clearly in its principles that evidence and data should be used throughout. And so my argument would be that scientific evidence and data should be fundamental to each of the 5 cases that the Green Book sets out. And again, it's not designed to be a prescriptive template. It's up to the owner of the decision, in this case the vaccine task force, to decide pragmatically what evidence should be included and what level of judgment is applied in the assumptions in the case.
I'm going to move on now to ask about vaccine manufacture and onshoring capabilities and the spending decisions around those. You explain within your statement it was recognised that from the earliest weeks of the pandemic, the UK needed to work urgently to develop domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity. If we could have a look, perhaps, just to illustrate the point, at INQ 000421297. This is a letter from Matt Hancock MP, the Secretary of State at the time, to the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury, a little later than we've been talking about, the 18th of June 2021. If we see it at paragraph 3 there, it's recognised that the UK is not alone, that there is competition, as it were, out there, and the VTF has been asked to identify transformational investments which will significantly strengthen the UK's long-term responsiveness to future pandemics. And if we have a look at also page 2, please, paragraph 2, time is not on our side. Not only can some of these investments provide contributions to our vaccine resilience late this year and early next, but global competition is fierce. So was it clear throughout the period in which spending decisions were being considered that there was a real urgency over vaccine manufacture? And we can take that down now. Thank you.
Yes, and I hope you can see that throughout in all of our advice and in our interactions, the resilience of the UK manufacturing sector for vaccines was a significant priority for the Treasury. And later that year at SR21, which took place in November, as the correspondence alludes to, we invested in a range of different options, including the VMIC, Braintree, the CPI in Darlington, and we also provided some further funding to BEIS to invest in resilience in manufacturing overall.
If we could just talk about some of those specific investments, dealing first with the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre. The inquiry has already heard evidence today about the fact that that was a facility that would hopefully promote, develop and accelerate new vaccine production, technology and manufacturing. But the project suffered significant issues and delays to the point where it was no longer commercially viable. There was significant investment in the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre. Could you set that out for us in summary?
Yes, so I think the first investment from the government was undertaken in 2017, and you can see a series of further investments over the course of that period leading up to SR21. At SR21, by that point, £205.7 million had been invested in VMIC, and at the SR we provide a further £80 million in order to complete the project.
You've exhibited correspondence which explains there are a number of further delays from 2021. It appears associated with construction and delivery, and it became apparent that it wasn't going to be useful within the immediate life of the pandemic. And of course, eventually in 2022, it was sold. What was the rationale from a Treasury perspective behind that sale?
So I think you can see from the correspondence between the Chief Secretary and George Freeman that we were actually quite concerned about the sale and the potential repercussions for resilience. And we asked a number of quite searching questions about whether that really was the right option. So we looked at what was being done to address residual vulnerabilities, what the scenarios were for step-in rights and whether we would lose those step-in rights, what would we actually do. We also asked BEIS to set out all of the other alternative options that they'd considered and to look at the impact on other innovation investments that we'd previously provided funding for. And ultimately, there's a chain back and forth on all of those questions. Ultimately, the Chief Secretary took the view that we had to rely on the expert views of BEIS and ministers there, but there were several conditions that we put on that sale, with each of those conditions and issues being raised.
Were the funds from the sale, are you able to assist us with whether they were directed back into manufacturing so as to ensure that investment was not lost?
I'm afraid I don't specifically know the answer to that question.
The decision, and you may be aware of some of the concerns expressed, that the decision to sell was a move in the wrong direction because it lost significant manufacturing capacity, perhaps that's obvious, but also those relationships with vaccine manufacturers which went along with it. Did the Treasury consider the impact specifically of the relationship loss in its decision-making?
I don't recall seeing specific evidence of that, but I think I can obviously see that that was the case from the information that has been provided by the department. But ultimately, our responsibility in the Treasury was to provide the approval, given it was quite a novel and contentious thing to have done, and especially given the amount of taxpayer money involved. Ultimately, it was up to BEIS to provide assurances and to meet the conditions that we put on the sale.
Just touching briefly on two other manufacturing investments, which I think you have mentioned, Braintree and the Centre for Process Innovation. Simply to ask, do you know, are you aware of the current status of these sites?
Forgive me, I don't. It's beyond the scope of my current responsibilities.
Perhaps the last important point to mention is the Moderna strategic investment. Strategic partnership was agreed with Moderna the end of 2022. The inquiry's understanding is that this is a 10-year partnership agreement. How does that partnership assist the UK in strengthening its domestic manufacturing capabilities?
I'm afraid I wasn't directly involved in that strategic partnership other than the oversight of the funding that was provided alongside the deal, so I don't know the detail.
All right, I'm going to turn now to another topic which is somewhat controversial at the time and a matter of importance to a number of core participant groups in the inquiry, and that's the termination of the Valneva contract. Valneva was one of the manufacturers within, of course, the VTF portfolio, but its contract was terminated, ultimately never rolled out to the public. I don't need to go through with you the fine detail of this, but if we might look at an email, please, from September 2021, and if we could have on screen INQ 005129111. And within page 1, we can already see this is, thank you. In fact, could we just zoom out again so I can see? Thank you. The date on this is the 10th of September 2021. And it is an email representing the view of the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Steve Barclay, about the termination of the Valneva contract. The beginning of the email, and if we could zoom back in now, thank you, explains his view is that if the clinical advice is the vaccine doesn't work, we should terminate with immediate effect in line with the advice. And I appreciate clinical advice is something outside entirely of your remit. There is in the second paragraph a desire to recover costs. And then this, which I'd like to ask you about. Finally, he noted it was surprising that the advice was not being shared with the Secretary of State BEIS and Lord Agnew, given they are members of the VTF. And the advice notes this is one of the 2 vaccines scheduled for delivery at significant volumes. He noted that this points to an earlier concern that there seems to have been a change of approach to engagement with the ministers and commercial experts within the VTF since the change of leadership, and he goes on to ask for some follow-up actions to be carried out in respect of that. Thank you, we can take that down. So the concern which seems to be expressed here, if we cast our minds back towards the beginning of your evidence, the very effective ministerial panel that you described, that the process for the termination of the Valneva contract had not gone through the panel in that same way. Can you help us with what the Treasury's understanding at the time was of the position and any concerns around that?
Yes, so it's correct that it didn't go through the ministerial panel in the way that decisions of this nature normally would, we were directly approached by the vaccine taskforce with a recommendation to cancel the Valneva contract. And as you can see from that correspondence, the Minister was quite keen that the principles of the ministerial panel were put into practice for this decision. And I think that's important given we'd spent £354 million by this point on the Valneva vaccine. I would note that we were forecast to spend an additional £590 million. And so what isn't in that correspondence directly, but is in other parts of my evidence, is that we also did look at the value for money of that decision.
Did you understand the reason for that process not having been followed?
I don't.
And do you know what the outcome was in terms of that being fixed or followed subsequently?
I recall that the information was shared as the Chief Secretary requested, but I don't have any other details of what the follow-up was to that process.
You may be aware that there was some concern, including from Dr. Clive Dix, that decision at the time was misguided because it might do damage to the wider relationship with the pharmaceutical and bioscience industry, given the decision and also the timing of it. Is that something that the Treasury took into account when it was involved in these discussions?
That wasn't within our role and remit, and I can obviously see where Clive is coming from, but that wasn't a particular issue or within the responsibilities of the Treasury.
I'm going to move on now to a different topic, and that's therapeutics, and in particular, first, antivirals. Ultimately, the UK government secured over 5 million courses of antivirals to treat COVID-19, and the Treasury, of course, approved that funding. But there have been some concerns that there was less of a willingness to invest in development of antivirals versus vaccines. Can you explain, please, what the Treasury's view, if any, was on what ought to take priority when it came to spending decisions?
Yes, so it's important to emphasise that the Treasury always saw a very critical role for antivirals in the response to the pandemic, especially in relation to clinically vulnerable groups and for those who could not have the vaccine. And I think we stressed that throughout all of our advice, and that's why we signed off an envelope of £621 million at the very start of the task force's work. The two phases that follow, there are different considerations at play. So in August, we're approached to review a business case with expenditure up to £11.1 billion over a 2-year period. And in effect, what the Treasury's advice set out was that there were some benefits to the case, particularly for the public health benefits that I've just alluded to, but also the commercial benefits of getting ahead and attracting the discounts that had been negotiated. But on the other side, you've got a very, very significant risk of a material amount of public spending. £11.1 billion would have been more than we were investing overall in vaccines. And we did have concerns about the clinical information we had available at the time about the effectiveness of antivirals. And at that stage, I don't think we'd undertaken peer reviews of the clinical studies that were available to us. So there was a very real risk that we were going to spend material sums of public funding on antivirals that may not ever be used or may not be effective. And I think it's right that we set out that balance of risks and benefits in the advice that we gave to ministers, and ministers ultimately concluded at that stage that they didn't want to increase investment. In the second phase, in December, when a further case is made to the Treasury.
Can I just pause you there, just to add some context? But no, please continue once I've done so. But the second phase was in response, was it not, to the Omicron variant and to a concern that some vaccines might not be as effective against the Omicron variant, and that antiviral investment needed to be increased in order to guard against that.
Yes, that's
Okay,
correct.
please continue. Thank you.
And I suppose that the additional consideration at that stage was one, whether we would be able to deliver the courses in time to respond to the peak of the Omicron variant, which was forecast to be in January in 2022. But also the point you've made about vaccine escape risk and to what extent there was evidence that for those who had been vaccinated, this would in any way reduce the rate of hospitalisation for vaccinated people. And that was quite a critical part of the decision-making from a value for money perspective. And Philip Duffy, my colleague who led on this, spoke to Jonathan Van Tam at the time to double check our understanding of this question of vaccine escape risk and effectiveness. And I think what Jonathan says is there's quite material variation in your value for money calculation depending on the range of results that they were seeing at the time. And the anticipation was that the panoramic trial would conclude in January, and so we should continue to invest in order to see the benefits of that trial and hopefully to be able to meet the demands of the Omicron peak. Yes,
sorry,
so they were
please
the considerations.
In terms of the business case that was submitted in that second phase after the Omicron variant was of real concern, the business case was submitted by DHSC and it had, if you like, the backing in the sense that it was supported by the department's senior clinical advisor and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. If their view was that it was advisable to increase funding in antivirals, was it for the Treasury to, if you like, overrule or go behind that by doing its own assessment of whether or not antivirals were something that ought to be invested in?
So I don't recognise the characterisation of the Treasury doing its own clinical assessment. The role of the Treasury is to faithfully represent the view of experts, and throughout the pandemic and in normal times, that is how Treasury sets out impartial, professional and objective advice to ministers. What is the purview of the Treasury is to set out the trade-offs in public spending. And it's important context that at this point I mentioned that, we're quite significantly ahead in vaccine rollout. You can see that the benefits to the economy are starting to take effect. And we've already spent a significant amount of public funding on the vaccines. At the same time, we're being asked to spend even more money on something that hasn't yet been proven to be effective. And so I think it's absolutely right that Treasury ministers are looking at the balance and proportionality of public spending, especially when it is such a significant sum of money. So at no point does the Treasury attempt to in any way take a clinical view. We're trying to balance the proportion of public spending and whether we think it's good value for money.
Right, I'm going to move on now then to the final matter I want to ask you about, which is under the heading of lessons learned and recommendations. You have already referred to some of the innovative ways of working that happened when it came to the investment in vaccines and therapeutics. Can you explain to us what was the good that came out of that part of the department's working, which you think would be beneficial to repeat should the UK find itself in the same situation again?
So I think there are three really core things. One is the explicit use of risk-based judgments and risk management techniques in articulating the balance of risk, how you try and quantify uncertainty and benefits when making these sort of decisions. And I think the fact that we very explicitly upfront said that we are going to take a very high-risk approach because the benefits are so overwhelmingly positive, that means we are fundamentally changing everything that we are doing. And I think using that sort of risk appetite framework in a professional way is incredibly important in decision-making. Secondly, we talked about the flexibility of the spending framework, and we've run a number of lessons learnt on the detail of that, which I won't go into. But I think it shows that you have to use the framework flexibly and in a very fast and agile way without in any way undermining the important delegations that we are given by Parliament for public expenditure. And we talked about the big spending envelopes, the way in which we did governance. They're all examples of applying that spending framework in a flexible way. And then the consolidation of governance. I mean, we would have saved many months, I believe, by consolidating into a single ministerial decision point. And I would repeat that immediately. And there are many instances outside of a pandemic where I think there are some valuable lessons to be learned.
And what about things that could have gone better? Have you identified any of those?
So I think there are a few things. Firstly, the use of data and the consistency of data. And I think the Chief Secretary alludes to this specifically in a number of different ways. But I think making sure that your data is shared, open, consistent. We did very well in lots of different circumstances, but really investing in the quality of data in government is key. Commercial skills, I think on one hand, we did a very good job at moving some of our most talented commercial leaders to the places they were needed most. But the raising of commercial skills across the whole of the civil service is an ongoing endeavour, and we've made lots of strides. But I very much agree with the comments that Kate Bingham has particularly made around STEM and commercial skills, and that happens to be part of my current role within the Cabinet Office and something I take very seriously. And then thirdly, embedding the Cabinet Office and Treasury up front into programmes. I cannot emphasise how important that was. We did it well in the case of vaccines, but to do it consistently I think matters. It means you're developing your understanding of decision making right from the start, rather than trying to play catch up later on in a process. And then finally, we did some very specific work on how we support accounting officers, and I think there's some quite technical aspects of the way in which we do that that we've documented some lessons learnt on in the Treasury in particular.
Thank you. Those are all of my questions.
I don't think there are any core participant questions. I'm really grateful, Mr. Little. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we've taken 2 permanent secretaries away from the Cabinet Office in the same day. I hope we haven't caused the machinery of government to come to a close. Anyway, I also don't know whether I might be asking for your help again. I do have other modules that may or may not be coming across your desk. So thank you in any event for the work, for the help you've given me so far.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. 10:30 Monday? 10:30 Monday. Thank you all.